Hello, YouTubers. Welcome to another edition of World History AP. It is I, Mr. Bartlett, and I'm here to try to impart some knowledge on you from what little I have. So here we go. We're going to talk today about some terms in the Middle Ages, and I'm going to skip around a little bit in your vocabulary to cover these thematically so that they make a little bit of sense. They don't go in order with your book reading, but they will go in order in my head. So today in this video we're going to talk about Middle Ages or medieval times. We're going to talk about manorialism or the manor system, and then we're going to talk about feudalism or the feudal system. So this is feudal Europe or manorial Europe or the Middle Ages. We kind of use these terms interchangeably because they're all kind of discussing what Europe was like at this time period. So let's start with the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is the name given to Europe from the fall of Rome in about the 5th century until about the 15th century, or the rise of European power. So this basically covers this entire Unit 3 time period from about the year 500 to about the year 1450. In the significance of Europe at this time is basically of the Middle Ages is that Europe is getting back on its feet, and Europe is becoming slowly, remember this took almost 1,000 years, slowly Europe is kind of gaining its position as a world power once again, and also Europe is shaping up into what it would become in the modern times, which is a series of nation states. So the Middle Ages was characterized by kingdoms. The Middle Ages was characterized by a lack of great growth or prosperity, mostly local trade, mostly local political rule, not as much interaction with the outside world, and not a whole lot going on culturally. They were kind of getting back on their feet. So they call this the Middle Ages because Europe at the time period before this was, for the most part, ruled by the Roman Empire, which was great. And then after this time period, Europe is kind of back as a world power. And so the Middle Ages is kind of the getting back together time period. An important term to understand, too, are manorialism and feudalism. So let's take a look at manorialism. The word manorialism, its root is manor, and the manor is the manor system, or manorialism, was a system in which landowners had a relationship with a political and economic relationship with the people who worked on their land. And this was a mutually beneficial relationship. And this was, for the most part, a self-sustaining relationship, meaning they produced everything that they needed on the manor, and they didn't necessarily need outside help. This is significant because it really characterized, or it was the key economic feature in Europe during the Middle Ages, and it would later grow into kingdoms, feudal kingdoms. And so these manors were usually had a lord or a wealthy landowner who was running the estate, and then the people who lived on the land were providing services, usually in the case of just general labor or agricultural labor. Europe was still a little bit behind the times when it came to farming and agricultural output, and so it took a mass amount of human labor to produce food. And there was a few people on the manor who would maybe do blacksmithing or some tailoring or some other artisan type work. They would maybe mill. Some people would mill the grain. There were some people who would cook or bake the grain, and this is where we kind of started to see occupations in Europe and specialized labor kind of come back again. So it's a little bit like Europe kind of hit the reset button and went back to kind of figuring out what civilized life was like. And this manor system was prominent throughout the region. So this kind of ties directly into the next word, which is feudalism. And feudalism is, while the manor system was mainly an economic and somewhat of a political rule because it was very local, feudalism became much broader. So let's talk about feudalism. Feudalism is the political relationship in which nobles or lords had several vassals beneath them, that is, people who owed them loyalty, and therefore were able to grow in political power. So this system actually led to a greater degree of power. As lords grew more and more powerful, they could um, kind of expand their influence around them and have a greater number of people who kind of were vassals to them. And as their influence and wealth grew, so did their power. And eventually, these feudal monarchies, where the king or the leader, the noble, was at the top, with minor lords or lesser nobles underneath them, pledging their support and pledging their military power, eventually grew in size to become the nations of Europe. And so this system of feudalism was again based on the same idea of manorialism, where there was mutual obligations and loyalty. But this one grew to have much more competition, so that groups who were vying for power with one another would be able to compete in this feudal system. So if you watch the show Game of Thrones, you kind of get the idea behind this loyalty and how sometimes loyalties can be broken. So those are three kind of key terms to keep in mind as we move forward with this unit and define Europe during the Middle Ages. So don't forget to be awesome.